For influencers in particular, it's the ethics piece, right? It's recognizing the power that you have and using it responsibly. And that's the thing I would occasionally be, and I am not, I do not have a massive following, and I don't get paid for my posts or anything along those lines. But I would occasionally notice I would say something and then it would get like embedded in a newspaper article. And then I would just think like, that's right, they can do that, which leads to, just some interesting ways that I started thinking about that now. Like, how do you strike that balance between being authentic and recognizing that what you say actually does potentially wind up in much, much broader
Yeah.
spaces? And how do you think about how to do that ethically?
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, Renee DiResta. Renee is a prominent researcher and one of the foremost experts on misinformation, social media, and online influence. She is the author of the new book, Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. And here are 3 things I think you should know about Renee. Number 1, in 2018, at the behest of the bipartisan leadership of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Renee led an investigation into the Russian Internet Research Agency's multi-year effort to manipulate American society. She presented public testimony, then led an additional investigation into influence capabilities that Russia used alongside its hack and leak operations in the 2016 election. Number 2, Renee joined the Stanford Internet Observatory, where she focused on studying and analyzing misinformation, disinformation, and the dynamics of influence on social media platforms. Her work involved investigating how false information spreads and affects public discourse and policy. Number 3, Renee has impeccable academic and professional credentials to inform us about misinformation and influence, including fellowships with Mozilla and the Truman National Security Project, and affiliations with the Council on Foreign Relations, the Harvard Berkman Klein Center, and the Columbia University Data Science Institute. Renee is a regular contributor at The Atlantic and Wired. Her bylined writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Columbia Journalism Review, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Politico, and The Guardian, among others. She was even featured in The Social Dilemma, the film on Netflix. Renee, you have been called many things, an insightful expert and leading authority on influence, especially the harmful kind. Online conspiracy theorists have called you CIA Renee, which you could tell us a little bit about later. People who read your book have called you brilliant and informative. I have to agree. Today, we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's so great to be here.
Well, this is such an important interview for us because we talk to so many leaders who are trying to influence others. And obviously you do that in your own way, but you have covered influence as a journalist and as an author. On the cover of your book, Invisible Rulers, there is another phrase that probably could have been an alternate title for the book, I would guess. Yeah. If you make it trend, you make it true. And I wondered if you could start off by telling us about this idea of invisible rulers, which isn't new, and how it has evolved to where it is today.
Yeah, so invisible rulers is a phrase that kind of one of the earliest propaganda theorists, Edward Bernays, wrote about in the late 1920s. He used the term to describe people who had the power to shape public opinion where the public didn't actually ever see them. They didn't really know who they were engaging with or encountering. And he describes it as being the people behind the politicians, the people who write brand copy for big corporations. He really connected the dots between the power to persuade about purchasing a product and the power to persuade when it came to political spheres. And he linked the two around the idea that there were people who were just very, very good at appealing to people in their identity as members of groups. And I wanted to write about what that role, those figures who appeal to us in our identities as members of groups, what that had evolved into over the next century, and how propaganda had changed, how our sense of who was persuasive, how visible, how clearly and transparently we understood that they were persuasive. I wanted to write a little bit about that. So when I set out to write a book about influencers, I wanted to connect the dots both to the political and also to the people who sell you shoes, who then all of a sudden also have the power to potentially influence your choice of who to vote for, right? So there was I wanted to look at that 1 century later, and that was the point of the book. And the phrase "if you make a trend, you make it true," I think that came from a talk I wrote in 2015, so almost a decade ago now. And I was talking about the incredible power of virality. And when you saw something trending on Twitter, one thing that I had begun to notice by this point was that getting something trending was really a game. It was something that everybody was trying to do. And Twitter was relatively primitive in how it understood what a trend was, what an authentic trend was. And so you had a whole lot of different activist organizations from across the political spectrum. And you had a whole lot of people like fandoms for bands, you name it, all kind of cooperating to try to capture attention by making something trend. If it showed up on the Twitter trends list, other people paid attention to it and people engaged with it. And one thing that began to happen was that as trends went from being like, Justin Bieber or or things that were more just sort of cultural into things that were moving into the realm of the political, what you started to see were trends where they were being used to shape public opinion, often with very kind of misleading angles, incorrect facts, these sorts of things. But once they had trended, nobody paid attention to the correction after the fact. So what had happened, what had trended was essentially, I use the term true kind of loosely, but it became the perception of the community in that moment in time. And oftentimes it was very, very difficult to sway them away from this understanding of the world that had happened during that trend.
And perception is reality, as we often hear. I wonder if you could just, what inspired you to get into this work? When I was reading your, background and credentials, I saw that in college you studied political science and computer science, I think. And,
Yeah,
that's really relevant for when we think about what's trending, because there's the people side and then there's the algorithm side. But
right.
at what point did this topic of online information, misinformation, propaganda sort of become one that you decided, I'm going to pursue this, since you've done a lot of other things in your career?
Yeah, it was when it became sort of personal for me, which I guess is how a lot of people wind up shifting interest areas. I had a baby in 2013, and I started getting a lot of Facebook group recommendations to go join anti vaccine groups. I had joined a few kind of crunchy mom groups around like making your own baby food, cloth diapering. And so Facebook's algorithms intuited that like I might be interested in this other thing because a lot of crunchy moms are also anti-vaccine. I was neither particularly crunchy nor anti-vaccine, and so it was sort of a an interesting collection of recommendations to get. They also started pushing me like backyard chickens, right? Go raise chickens in your backyard. Um, and I was sort of captivated by that. Around the couple of months later, there was a measles outbreak in Disneyland, and that was sort of fascinating to me because it was, I was curious about to what extent social media conversations about vaccines, which as I was seeing in my own experience, just this barrage of content pushed to me as a new parent it was very scary, right? It was stories of babies dying of SIDS and literally ad targeting you as a new parent with images of babies who had died and saying vaccines cause SIDS, vaccines cause autism, vaccines cause allergies, all of these things. And so there was this barrage. And I thought, I bet hesitancy is probably increasing as a result of this. I have no power to prove that, right? That's way outside of the scope of what I can do as an ordinary person. But I can do network analysis, right? To understand like who controls the conversation, who is putting out the content that people are seeing. And it turns out that overwhelmingly, even though most people in the US, this is again 2015, long prior to COVID, were still vaccinating their children, the people who were talking about it on social media were this very passionate group of diehard anti-vaccine activists. And so they were shaping the content that was trending. They were shaping the conversation around vaccines. And as the measles outbreak began, I started paying a lot more attention to this question of where were the public health authorities in the conversation? Where were the people who supposedly knew the facts, who had the power to counterspeak, to get accurate information out. And I worked with a data scientist to do a network map of Twitter. And we observed that the public health folks were just not even in the same conversation. The anti-vaccine activists were far more influential. They had more reach. They had networked into other large communities, and they were really using social media in a way that sort of institutional communicators just weren't. And for me, that was, kind of a very interesting insight, also a very alarming insight, candidly. And so I said, all right, well, that's going to have to change at some point, right? Turns out the answer is no. We get to COVID and it's still very much the same. Um, but I wound up then looking at other groups that were kind of active and networked on social media, and it just became looking at sort of one adversarial actor after another. After the anti-vaxxers, it was ISIS, and it became Russia in 2016. It just became interesting to me as like a more of a phase shift in how people communicated and who was influential, as opposed to just trying to understand the mechanics of one specific group.
And as we talk about these issues, like whether it's vaccines or something else, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of reporting that talk about quote misinformation and quote disinformation. I know you've said this might be a misdiagnosis of the problem. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I never liked the term misinformation very much. It was handy, when you're talking about vaccines causing autism, for example. That is misinformation. At this point, there is so much scientific body of knowledge to refute that claim, to say no, this is false, this is not true. But as we were looking at that broader concept of what went viral on the internet, what was trending, what people were sitting up and paying attention to, it wasn't stuff that was demonstrably false. It was stuff where you didn't actually know what the truth was yet, right? Things where you actually couldn't know in that moment if it was true or not. And so what was happening in a lot of these trends, what was happening in a lot of these kind of online communities, was not so much a problem of facts and everybody just has some bad facts. And if we just gave them the right facts, they would say, oh, sure, got it. Okay, whoops, we were wrong. No, that's not what's happening at all. What's happening is you have unverified information. You have people sharing that unverified information, passing it from person to person. It's very, very old behavior. We used to, we've been doing this since humans organized into societies. You would, share information through your village, word of mouth. But what was happening when it happens online, a lot of the time it's happening because it's perceived as a almost like in a factional way, right? We in this highly homogenous community are going to make up our mind about this thing. We're going to get very, very mad about it. It's going to trend. Again, it's usually something where you actually can't know the facts in that moment. Other people from another political faction might come in and fight with us about it. That actually only sort of furthers the trend and increases the attention to it. But ultimately, the facts aren't going to be found out for, maybe hours, maybe days, maybe weeks in some cases after the fact. And so you have the public opinion formation is happening in that moment. People are kind of deciding on reality in that space, in that conversation. And again, going back to if you make a trend, you make it true. The actual facts, like the sort of outcome, the truth of the rumor, if you will, is not necessarily going to trend. So we saw this over and over and over again in 2020 with claims about voting. There would be a story of ballot mules tossing something into a box, right? And if you believed that there was a epidemic of illegal voting, these things would go viral, right? And it would take days sometimes for somebody to come out and say, this is a real person, this is, they're carrying their family's ballots. This is not some sort of vast illegal vote operation. But again, you would see the sort of repetition of these stories where the allegations of fraud would go viral, the rumor would go viral, and then the facts actually never even really connected because it takes time to find out the truth. So I felt like misinformation was just was a misdiagnosis of what was actually happening in those moments, in those times. And we started moving to talking about it much more in the context of rumors and then propaganda. Because again, a lot of the time the rumors would be picked up by people who had a political agenda and who could use the rumors to further that political agenda. And so it was very much this very human process that's happening, people trying to make sense of the world, but it also became very potent for people with a real agenda to go and pick up those allegations, pick up those claims, pick up those rumors, and then blast them out with a very sort of political angle to them. So I felt like that was how we should be talking about this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I thought you did so well in the book is these things that, like the ballots, supposedly being thrown away or on the side of the road or whatever, things that I had seen bits of in the news, but through the news sources that I consume and not the full landscape. You really kind of zoomed out and showed like, how did this start? Where did this go? Who was behind? And you sort of connect the dots around some of those things, and it's frankly some of the greatest hits of misinformation and propaganda online, whatever you want to call it. We all have kind of different terms we can use. You sort of took many of those things that I was familiar with as a consumer of news and then really dived in and I revealed, I guess I'll say, some facts behind them that I just wasn't aware of how that got started or who pushed that. And I think that's one of the things that people will find really fascinating about your book, and kind of the invisible rulers behind this stuff, but also pretty sobering to know that there are these sophisticated operations doing that.
There's anybody who's paying attention to the political debates. I don't know if you watched it. I did. This is like sports for me. I there was the moment when Trump referenced they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, right? I don't know how many people
Yeah.
know what I'm talking about, but this rumor that Haitian immigrants in Springfield,
Even if you
Ohio,
didn't watch the debate, you're seeing the
you
memes.
have now heard it. Yes. But what was very interesting about that is it's another example of how this works, right? You have an allegation made in a Facebook group where somebody says, my friend's cat went missing, my friend's daughter's cat. There's different versions of the story. They've actually kind of tracked down that woman, and she says, well, actually, no, I had no firsthand knowledge. I was just resharing it because I thought it was interesting. I thought my community should know. She's sharing it in a public community safety group, right? This allegation that that Haitian people have like abducted and are eating this cat, right? And this is, these are the sorts of things where you probably remember urban legends about cats when you were a kid. I do. I remember like keep your pets inside on Halloween, or like Satanists will go and get them. This was during the like satanic panic of the 80s and 90s, right? So there have been these urban legends, these rumors, but this then gets picked up. It takes on a very political valence, right? JD Vance, the senator from Ohio, vice presidential candidate, goes and picks up that rumor. And it winds up, again, it's moving through this right-wing online rumor mill. If you're not on those social media platforms, you don't even see it. You have no idea that eating the cats, eating the dogs is a thing till Donald Trump expresses it during a debate. Yep. And what's very interesting about it is you can see the Google search trends around that moment where a whole bunch of people type in eating the cats because they're like, what is this man talking about? Because if you're not in that extremely online space, if you're not on those platforms, if you're not in that echo chamber, you actually have no idea what this is even about. Yeah. And so it's a sort of, again, another fascinating glimpse into the extent to which like communication ecosystem is fragmented. And as a result, reality is fragmented. It is completely, it is reality for a certain percentage of people who see that rumor that there are Haitian immigrants who are going and eating dogs and cats. Yeah. The president of the United States, former president of the United States, expressed it in a debate. So this, it has impact, it has influence, it reaches people, it connects with them. And if you're not part of those communities, you don't even see it.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Google search trends. So, I want to ask you a question here. So you worked at the Stanford Internet Observatory, and something happened there, and I didn't even know what exactly. So I Googled what happened to the Stanford Internet Observatory, and the top two organic, there were no ads, Google results were, one said the Stanford Internet Observatory is being dismantled, and the other said, update, Stanford has not shut down or dismantled the Internet Observatory as a result of outside pressure. So I'm going to scratch my head. Which is it? And I figured I'll go to a source who will really know and ask you. But I think I want to know the answer. But I think also just that shows how really quickly we can get confused by information that's out there on the internet when we're looking for answers. So anyway, maybe you can tell us.
Or even like, the truth is somewhere in the middle. In that particular case, so Stanford didn't renew a lot of us, myself included, I think most of us, and the remaining, I think maybe, two people who were there are going to be refocused on child safety, which is more aligned with what the faculty director wants to study. And so that's the determination that they made. But it is absolutely true that Stanford ceased to conduct rapid response election research and a lot of the state actor research and many of the things So SIO is a very interdisciplinary center. We focused on a lot of different, what we call adversarial abuse areas. I did a ton of work on spam and scams. I did a bunch of work on state actors, a bunch of work on election narratives. That stuff is no longer going to happen. But some of the work on child safety and stopping child exploitation will likely happen in some capacity. And it's sort of unclear to me, too, from the outside now, to what extent they're going to keep the brand.
Yeah. When we think about trusted news sources, the number 3 Google result, you said somewhere, the truth is somewhere in the middle, was from NPR, and it was SIO's future is uncertain. And that's
I
probably,
mean, that's the
no, I love my trusty NPR, it's one of,
evergreen. Yeah.
um,
No, I think it reflects, though, the in that particular case, there's questions like, what does it mean to continue? If is it like, does dismantling involve abandoning a brand, or does it
yeah.
involve nobody working there anymore? So Stanford did quibble with the wording on some of those articles, but the overall crux of it is they're not doing the kind of work that we used to do.
Yeah. Now
Yeah.
you've been covering this issue for a long time. I mean, just a lot of wonderful pieces out there from the Atlantic, Wired, etc. In 2018, you wrote a piece for Wired entitled "Free Speech is Not the Same as Free Reach," and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that philosophy and how others have reacted to or embraced it.
Yeah, that went everywhere.
Yeah.
That was sort of, you never know where your stuff's going to end up. And so Asa Raskin and Tristan Harris and I, in 2017, 2018, were doing a lot of work on asking questions around, how do you convey to the public some of the interesting structural shifts of the internet? How do you emphasize the need to preserve free expression while also highlighting that algorithmic curation isn't neutral, right? And that what you see is not just a function of who is speaking. And the idea that we maybe had in the town square, you have this metaphor of the public square, right? And everybody's there in a real physical public square. Everybody's around there, and they hear one speaker. Maybe it's a crazy person with a megaphone, and then another person stands up and says, no, that's not true. Let me explain the facts around this, right? And everybody hears the same debate. They're literally in the same physical space. And that's not what happens on social media. So we were trying to emphasize some of these differences, and just structurally, like, virality is not is an engineered thing. It is not something where the best idea rises to the top the way we might have understood the marketplace of ideas to function in that physical space in the past. It's that people who are very, very good at coordinating to game an algorithm, who use fake accounts to do that. There are all sorts of manipulative ways to create a perception that you hold the dominant opinion. And as we've just discussed, the counter speech might not even make it into the same sphere, depending on which types of, online factions and media environments and influencers you follow. And so as we were writing about this, the phrase is Aza's. He kind of wrote it on a whiteboard. And then, if I recall correctly, I think he actually went to Burning Man as I was writing the article. So sort of a funny, it's very San Francisco. We were out in the valley at the time. And I wanted to get it out because there was something that had happened. I think, if I recall correctly, it was Donald Trump complaining about what Google search results were surfacing and what trends were surfacing. And you were starting to see that fight about curation recast as some sort of censorship, that if your points of view did not get top billing on Google search results or did not get top billing on a social media platform, that you were being censored. And so what we were trying to do was tease out this difference between free speech, which is your right to express a viewpoint, and free reach, which was what the Facebook recommender systems and trending algorithms, curation algorithms, were awarding, in a sense, to particular types of viewpoints. And we were really trying to emphasize, like, this isn't neutral. And also, and this is an opinion that I still very much hold, you can create an environment where, for example, an anti-vaccine group can go set up shop on Facebook, and that's fine. And if people want to go and search for it, that's great. But there's a difference between proactively going and searching for something, finding speech, choosing who to follow, seeing the content from the people you follow, and what was happening, which was the platform proactively pushing this stuff out
Right.
to you. And at the time, QAnon was a thing that was, exploding. And the idea that social media platform recommender systems were like inadvertently pushing people down rabbit holes, that was where we were like, hey, maybe, maybe there should be some differentiation here between your right to speak and express your viewpoint and have your content up on a platform
Yeah.
and the idea that you are owed reach in response. And so that idea actually made the rounds. Sacha Baron Cohen used the phrase in a talk he was giving. If I'm not mistaken, his was about hate speech. It was, I think it was maybe a talk at the ADL, if I'm recalling correctly. A couple of years after that, Elon Musk picked it up, and it became is literally encoded in the algorithm. Actually, there's like a little comment section, and it's sort of the top of his moderation framework, where he's basically arguing, we're gonna shift Twitter's moderation policies such that all of these voices that were kicked off, that were in some cases very, very extreme voices, we're going to let them all back on, but we're going to try to make sure that they don't get reach. And that was, again, a kind of an acknowledgement of the point that we'd made back in 2018, sort of showing up again, 5 years later or something, becoming the sort of moderation policy of one of the biggest social media platforms out there.
Yeah. That's a legacy for having written that and that being
well,
adopted.
it was funny though, because by the time that happened, Elon was also accusing us and me of being some sort of like insane censors out to suppress speech on Twitter and everywhere else. And so the irony of this, like, do you know that like this is that's actually my viewpoint right there that you have up there on your page, and yet over here you're caricaturing me as this like secret spy censor woman out to like suppress conservatives on Twitter, which was absolute horseshit from day one.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. One of the things you said, written about, is that in today's world, influence and expertise have been decoupled. And I know you've spent a lot of time learning what bad actors are doing to influence public opinion, and you have so many examples of that in the book. I wonder what advice you have for people who see themselves as good actors. They're real experts in science, medicine, policy. They want to influence public discourse, and maybe they feel like their ideas are being drowned out by all this other stuff. What advice do you have for them, having done so much research on this topic?
It's really it's a hard one. So when we were talking a little bit earlier, I mentioned that in the old anti-vaccine network maps we did in like 2015, public health was like totally outside of the conversation, right? They didn't have any accounts with large followers. They weren't networked. One of the things you have to have in this communication environment is a network. It's not enough to just be out there posting your stuff, because the real reach that you get comes from other people, supporters, people who are interested, amplifying you. That's the entire ball game, right? That is what happens in a networked communication environment. You can have the most incredible degree of expertise, accuracy. We saw this during COVID. Twitter was trying to elevate the voices of frontline physicians, you might recall, in 2020, people who were actually working in emergency rooms. And then they would come home and they would say, these are the morgue trucks outside the hospital. This is real. You should take it seriously, right? And yet, most of those people had not inserted themselves into the public conversation previously. And so one of the problems that they have is they don't have that network. During COVID, it shifts a little bit because everybody is locked in their houses, doom scrolling, trying to find people. You do see them amass some following. You do see the public retweeting them. So they start to get a little bit more of that. But the flip side of it, though, interestingly, is that if you insert yourself into a conversation that has very high stakes, you'll also be mercilessly harassed, right? And so you're also asking people, like, for whom this is not their job, right? They're not making money off of this. They're not setting out to be influencers. They're not working to build a brand and establish themselves as, kind of like paid commentators in the public sphere. They're just ordinary people who are out there trying to express what they know, what they see, what they have expertise in. And one of the things that you do see in a lot of these conversations, public health, it's been rather notorious, is the attacks and the attempts to drive people out of the conversation. And so you do see some of these figures trying to figure out, like, how do you do this, like, safely? And so I think if you've been in the public conversation for a long time, for me, it started in maybe 2014. Like, that's the first time I got doxxed. Um, you just develop a different set of skills, maybe around like, you know, how you're going to speak, what you're going to put out there, how you're going to protect your personal information, the networks that you're going to build, those amplification chains and tools for mutual support and things like this, mutual, getting attention to the same kinds of things. So you're seeing now, I think, institutionalists trying to pick up the skill sets that the extremely online have had for about a decade. And it's been interesting to watch because, again, just to emphasize one more time, this is not their actual job, right? Their
Right.
job is to be a doctor. Their job is to be a public health official. Their job is not to be an expert communicator on the internet. In fact, it can be a particularly different skill set, right? And so we need to have more of it because this is how people form opinions today. If opinions are being shaped on social media, then you have to be in the conversation on social media. You can't just rely on, oh, I'll put out a press release, I'll give a press conference, and then the
Right.
public will hear the thing. And you saw during COVID, for example, you saw the CDC, the official speakers, really doing a lot of that. They weren't making compelling memes. Nobody wanted to share their stuff.
Yeah.
Their stuff wasn't interesting. It was like fact sheets in a press
Right.
release and a PDF on a website. And so even as social media platforms are out there willing to amplify good information, right? Even as the curators themselves, the people who control the algorithms are willing to curate good information, they themselves are saying the institutions aren't producing anything compelling. Like, we can put it out there, but we can't make people share it. We can't
Yeah.
drive it into the era of networked communication. And that gap is like, I have a whole chapter on COVID just trying to explain using that case study of like what needs to shift fundamentally, going forward.
I wonder if you can think of, are there institutions that you look at that you think have done a really great job of that, building their network or creating really compelling content? Because we can probably come up with a very big list of those that are still putting out PDF fact sheets, or, they only have their 1,000 followers and it's the same people who already believe what they believe.
Yeah, some of them that are really kind of, it's the ones who become fun, right? You've seen brands recognize this. Again, brands, the idea of influencers comes from brands. It's brands who realize that certain people are influential. And again, going back to invisible rulers, right? That these are the people who are going to sell their shoes for them. So you see brands do it first. You see like Wendy's and McDonald's Twitter accounts, like kind of playfully bantering with each other. And the public really likes it. You've seen some government institutions now in the US do this. I think the Parks Department does it. There's I'm trying to remember if it's like the Consumer Product Safety Board or what their proper name is, but the product safety agency that tells you like when something's been recalled.
Yeah.
Like, they're really good at it. They see a meme, they see some story in the public consciousness, and like they are on it with a way to connect it to their mission, to what they want you to know. 4th of July, here's our patriotic content, here's some meme that's going around. Also, by the way, fireworks are hideously dangerous. Like, here's what you need to know. Are they even legal? I don't know. Here's how you figure that out. And so you see that way of inserting themselves into the public conversation and speaking to the public in a different way, as opposed to just releasing a PSA on the website.
What I hear, though, the sort of subtext of what you're saying is there still aren't that many. I mean, you named a couple examples that I've heard of as well, but we still probably have a lot of work to do from an institution standpoint, don't
I
we?
think some of it is like, I was reading this article earlier today while I was eating lunch about Kamala Harris's team, right? And this is one of these interesting campaigns because she's very much seen as sort of a centrist institutionalist, right? Not like an insurgent bomb thrower the way Trump was during his campaign in 2016. And one of the things, I think it was, this was in the Washington Post, and what it was saying was that there's a group of like 25-year-olds who are sitting there in the rapid response room who get something out within an hour, right? It's not 6 layers of comms approvals in order to meet the moment. And so you see that question of, do you trust your people enough to give them the leeway to respond to what is essentially a very, very, very fast moving information environment for some agencies? And I don't know how this is determined, like, who within the federal government, or the agency makes this determination, but Some of them are able to do that fairly quickly, that to have that high degree of responsiveness, and others seem much more, um, maybe, I don't know if afraid is the word, but reticent maybe is the word, where, for something like public health, they do have to get it right. That's the thing, right? You are in a sense also constrained in that when you are authoritative, you should be held to a higher standard than some random influencer who is, just saying
Right.
some things online. And this does lead to a like a I would say almost like, I don't know, maybe unfair advantage is a reasonable way to put it. Just an advantage given to the person who has that freedom to
Yeah.
communicate, um, where if they get it wrong, they can just say like, "Oh, whoops,"
Yeah.
well, I was just talking, right? As opposed to an authoritative institution where there can be some real consequences for that.
Let me ask you this. This summer we have two examples of authoritative institutions, for the first time each of them embracing influencers as trusted messengers for their brands. One was the NATO summit. NATO brought a couple dozen, I think, 20 or so influencers in, and really, they were meeting with presidents of countries, and they were attending events because they know that most Americans don't know much about NATO and how important it is, and they figured that that would be a good way to get the message out. I think it was seen as pretty successful. And then the DNC influencers were given a platform there. Many journalists complained that the influencers were treated better than they were. So do you think, I mean, what's your take on that? Do you think that this is a really good way to try to reach people? Or do you worry that that will kind of cheapen the trusted institutions because those influencers might be seen as peers to the others that are just saying totally inaccurate things?
I think, it's a shifting time. I think ultimately I was happy on both counts. I thought, okay, this is great to see that recognition that for a lot of young people in particular, this is where they're getting their news. This is where they're getting their content. If they're going to even know that the NATO summit exists, having the NATO summit content show up on TikTok is honestly the way to do that. Having it show up on Instagram is the way to do that,
Mm-hmm.
where people are getting the information where they are. It is still going, to the sort of proper news channels. As you note, the journalists are there also. I think one thing that is uncomfortable and that I think needs to be dealt with pretty directly is influencer disclosure laws are not up to where they need to be. There are more regulations in the United States around the influencer transparency. They have to be more transparent about selling you those shoes than they do about saying that they're expressing a paid political opinion, right? That to me is horribly backwards. I think that those disclosure laws, particularly from the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, really need to come up to speed and to recognize that when you have people who are influential and who are expressing a political opinion, they should be disclosing if they have a relationship to a campaign, a relationship to a party. That should be part of the transparency process so that the audience understands what they're engaging with. And I think that kind of transparency is immensely valuable, and it's something that really needs to happen. And unfortunately, what we've seen is the FEC sort of punting on that because it's political speech. Yes, it is, but at the same time, political advertising is political speech, and we have a ton of
Yeah.
disclosure laws around that. The idea that this should be kept separate, I think, is actually backwards. I think that this is
Mhm.
going to be far more influential than ads, and it needs to be recognized when it is paid, when there is a paid relationship there, when there is even an in kind, hey, we're going to bring you in and you're going to say this, you're going to talk about what you hear. They
Yeah.
need to be transparently disclosing that, and I think that those loopholes need to be fixed.
Hmm. And it sounds like you're saying that what's regulated through the Federal Trade Commission for brands is more robust currently than for political.
It's
But
not it's
I,
not even brands. If I were to accept money, $5,000 to promote like Tide on my Instagram, I have to disclose that Tide is paying me. And I
yeah,
have to disclose it in a way that is clearly visible and immediately adjacent to the content,
yeah,
right? It can't just be like, oh, if you Google me, I mention on my website
yeah, yeah.
that I have a relationship with Tide. It's got to be like there and visible and in proximity to the message in whatever format the message takes. And so there's these laws um, around essentially truth in advertising, or transparency in advertising,
Yeah.
maybe is the better way to put that. We've recognized that for a long time. These laws evolve year over year. They started with mommy bloggers, back when it wasn't social media at all, and you were a mom reading a blog, and if you wanted to know if the mom talking about how great Tide is for her wash routine is being paid, like that was when some of these regulations began to
Yeah.
come into effect.
And I guess some would say, even with those FTC regulations, they're just not even widely enforced. That there's a lot of
That's
people.
exactly right. That's the next piece, right?
Yeah.
There is that. It's interesting to see like what they go after and when.
Yeah.
But we just had a really interesting dynamic around around influencers being paid by the Russian state
Yeah.
surreptitiously behind the scenes. The question of how political influencers make their money, who they're responsive to, who they're paid by, a lot of these things need to be updated to
Mm,
account for this new information ecosystem.
yeah.
And it's regulators who are asleep on the job that or don't want to take on
Mm.
have the political fight that are the reason that we are where we are on that.
Well, speaking of regulators, I mean, you communicate with government and private sector leaders, not just in your role where you're, writing about influence and sharing with all of us, but you're probably trying to convince them and influence them yourself because you believe that there are some changes that could be made that would, help address this, and you want them to implement those changes. What strategies do you use to influence others? I mean, you've spent so much time studying how influence works, and you gave some really great suggestions earlier when it comes to social media about creating content that sort of is authentic and resonates in this fashion, building your networks, responding quickly. But when you're trying to get leaders to realize there are problems that you believe we can solve, and here's how to do it, what do you think about when you yourself, Renee, are trying to influence
Yeah.
them?
So some of it is so a lot of times I write. One thing that's very interesting is how often when you give a briefing, the staffer or someone else will ask, "Do you have anything you've previously written?" So as
Mm,
they're introducing you to the principal or to the meeting or to whatever it is, you do have an opportunity to point to things that you've done. So for me, that's research papers that are public, or it's writing that's public. So I'm really everything that I'm saying in a briefing, I am also saying very much publicly. Right? There's no gap there for me. And when you are having the conversation for a briefing, it's understanding, what is the win for them, right? What is it that are they trying to craft legislation? Do they want to be more informed? Are they interested in beginning to make this a core issue, to weigh in on it repeatedly? When you're in academia, you will get requests from staffers, for example,
mm,
to talk about a bill. Right, Representative so and so is interested in taking this issue on. What are the things that they should think about? And then in that regard, it's well, here's the research that I've done on that topic, and here's how, as you think about these bills, past bills have had the following pitfalls. Here's where I would do that differently. And so it's, so my assumption is that they are speaking to many, many people, not just me. And so what I'm trying to do is just articulate, here's how I think about it. Here's how our research, here's the research that supports it. I always try to connect it back to something empirical. Here's why we think this matters.
yeah.
Here's the data that suggests that this matters. So for me, having that pipeline from actual empirical research to the kind of policy advisement process, like I want there to be a real clear line. Otherwise, I actually don't want to weigh in, right? I think it's also important to understand when you're not the best person to weigh in.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times there, I'll just say, oh, you should talk to so and so instead. This other person works on that more directly. I think though it's a question of like, what is the win for them? What is it they're going for? And how do you articulate the position or the point of view as backed by evidence in a way that helps them get to where they need to be for their output?
Well, it's interesting. That kind of highlights one of the big challenges that many DC-based organizations trying to influence policy face, is that we were talking about using social media to reach the public. And, people are going to look at the type of content you create, how many followers you have. But then now you're having meetings with principals in the policy environment, and they're not asking how many followers you have. They're wanting to see published research, or they're wanting to see articles that you've written. So for an organization that's trying to both influence policymakers and the public, and often you have to do both, it's a big challenge right now because the core competency of getting a paper published is very different from trending on Instagram, right? And so
Well,
I think it just kind of
yeah.
highlights this challenge that we are facing right now.
It absolutely does. I think it's also important to note with academia, like we have specific rules also around advocacy. Like
Mhm.
we're not lobbyists. You don't want to be a lobbyist for a bill that's
Yeah.
illegal, I believe. You want to be in a position where you're saying like, um, here is my understanding of this problem as derived from this work I did on it. So much more that than here's why you need to pass this bill. So a
Yeah.
little bit of a different model. I
Yeah.
can say in a panel like, I, as Renee, really like the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, where I'm speaking as
Mhm.
myself, as a person with an opinion, as opposed to inadvertently creating the perception that Stanford University holds
Sure.
that opinion, right? So,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of things that that I keep in mind when I'm communicating. But ultimately, as far as the work that we did at SIO, one reason that we attracted the attention we did is actually that we were very good at what
Yeah.
we did, and that we were very good at communicating about what we did in the moment. We got very bad at communicating about what we did after the inquiry started, and I can explain why that is. But in the moment, we were regularly out there with very transparent, in the moment tweet threads, blog posts,
Yeah.
articles, reports, so that people could see what we were doing. Because as far as we're concerned, like the public has to understand what is happening as well. We're long past the time when six senators in a room or the be all end all of coming to some policy about the internet. People have very, very, very strong feelings and opinions about social media, about the online space, because they use it so often. It's so core to their day-to-day experience. And so you want to communicate with the public so that the public understands
Yeah.
the work that we do, or the positions that we take.
Let me ask, you've written that the new media landscape is going to become more decentralized. And I wonder if you can just say more about that, but especially what do you think that means for leaders, like somebody who runs an organization and they want to influence public opinion, that things are so fragmented and decentralized, and then it's going to potentially keep going that direction.
It creates real challenges, because one of the reasons why influencers become popular is they become popular by appealing to a niche, right? To a small group of
Mhm.
people who are very, very passionate. It's very hard to start a media property or to be an influencer on a topic and be broadly appealing to the entirety of the American public, right? That was something that broadcast media at least nominally set out to do, even if it didn't get it right? There were plenty of voices and communities that did not see themselves represented in broadcast media. But the concern about propaganda in the age of broadcast media was that there would be this like hegemony, right? This like one overarching opinion would go out to all Americans, and that was the thing they were supposed to believe. Whereas what happens in the age of the internet is things move through the niches. And so it is actually very hard then to form that broader consensus reality when people are seeing different facts and being outraged about different topics and forming entirely different perceptions about what is going on in the world,
Yeah.
because the incentive for the influencer is to appeal to the niche, not the
Yeah.
broad public. Even on Substack, which sort of sees itself as distinct from social media, you're going to get subscribers from people who feel that you are like, who are passionate about your work. If you're putting out political content, you're not going to get subscribers from people in the other party who are, unless you're like really making an effort to bridge that divide. And this is the phenomenon of audience capture that happens, where people will continue to move their content more and more in the direction of the people who are either paying them with money
Yeah.
or giving them attention and helping them grow their clout.
Yeah, and I think it underscores that, for people who are trying to influence the public in particular, the previous strategy of going really broad and wide, which was just how you did it for so long, it's not the strategy that's going to work nowadays. What we're hearing from you is you need to go much more niche, and you need to segment that audience further and find, and I think it's a wake up call for people who are doing this work, and for leaders is that, hey, we probably need to take a step back and evaluate if our approach is really going to be the approach that's going to work into the future.
Yeah, or if it's going to reach those audiences that you need to reach. And this
Yeah.
is where the the influencer the influencers invited to the DNC address different types of DNC, or different types of like
Mhm.
Democrat or left or progressive audiences. They're not all the same kind of class of institutionalist
Yeah.
centrist Democrats that the Harris campaign largely is. So they're bringing people in from these other niches who are speaking to different, excuse me, specific subgroups of people along, whatever identity or interest base they have.
Yeah. Renee, we talked about so many different topics. When we read your book, there is a lot of bad stuff out there that we want to make better. And I just wonder, to close, could you tell us, what gives you hope after having dug into so much of the things that aren't working and the problems that we have and are going to continue to have? Can we end on a note of optimism? Is that okay?
Yeah. I think, there's a whole lot of people paying attention to these issues now. 10 years ago, or even in 2018, when we were having the freedom of speech, freedom of reach conversation, it was a very small group of people who were really trying to dig into what shifts made sense, right? How do you design better social media? What does better even mean? And now I think I'm really encouraged by the recognition that, platforms understand the role that they play. They are willing to experiment in some ways. You're seeing the rise of new platforms like Blue Sky, and Threads is like an outgrowth of Instagram, but Threads is integrating with the Fediverse, with Mastodon and the decentralized internet, sort of server-based, much more community-focused internet. So I think that there's a lot of technological shifts that are happening that are very interesting and that give us an opportunity to put more power and agency in the hands of users.
Yeah.
That also enable social media and smaller social media to think about bridging divides, using things like bridging algorithms that curate important divisive issues, but do it in a way that surfaces voices that are not actively out there seeking to cause fights, right? You can talk about abortion in very different ways, and meaning you can either be out there sort of demonizing your opponents and calling for people to go, show up at clinics and target doctors and, all sorts of different ways in which that conversation has happened in the past. Or you can surface the conversation and try to get at the debate by highlighting the issues, not in the most toxic voices possible that often attract currently the most attention. So rethinking what is happening there. I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of recognition that that these are the areas that we need to be exploring.
Well, Renee, your new book, Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. It is an incredible read, incredible listen for those of you who prefer that. Very sobering, but with some hope at the end. Do not skip the last chapter is my advice, because there's a lot of great stuff there that is a little bit.
I'm glad to hear you say that. It's funny because I remember talking to my publisher and I was like, I don't know how to, everybody wants, my friend called it the chapter 9 problem, right? Like nobody actually wants to read the solutions, or they're out of date by the time the book comes out. So I'm glad that you actually found it interesting and useful.
No, I did. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the whole thing. And, I think it's a really important thing. And look, from just the conversation today, if folks don't even read the book, I think just hearing, if you are a chief influencer, if you are a leader who's trying to get your message out and break through the noise, making sure that you build that network, because it's not just about pushing content out. When you do create content, it has to be a fit for the channels. It has to be authentic. There's a way that you can work with your network and influencers to do that fast. The rapid response examples that you gave. I mean, I just think that there's really some things that we can take away no matter who we are or what we're doing. And this sort of decentralization phenomenon that's going on can be difficult and challenging, but it also can create some really interesting opportunities. So
it does. And I think the only thing I would add to that is just for influencers in particular, it's the ethics piece, right? It's recognizing the power that you have and using it responsibly. And that's the thing that I think, I would occasionally be, and I am not, I do not have a massive following, and I don't get paid for my posts or anything along those lines. But I would occasionally notice I would say something and then it would get like embedded in a newspaper article. And then I would just think like, oh shit, that's right. They can do that, which leads to, just some interesting ways that I started thinking about that now. Like, is this, how do you strike that balance between being authentic and recognizing that, that what you say actually does potentially wind up in much, much broader spaces, and how do you think about how to do that ethically? And
the burden of being a chief influencer, of being an expert and an author, and I'm grateful for the work you do, and we're grateful that you took time to share your expertise with us today. So Renee DiResta, author of Invisible Rulers, thank you so much, and we appreciate the work you're doing and hope you continue it.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a chief influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time.